Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I am your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko here in Ohio.
And we're going to be talking about the history and politics of Los Angeles and immigration and Mexican and Central American immigration in light of current events. We thought this was like a pretty important topic to have a little bit of a deep dive on. And to discuss this with us today is Professor Enrique Ochoa, who is a professor of history and Latin American studies at California State University in Los Angeles. He's a native of Los Angeles who grew up in the San Gabriel Valley and got his BA, MA, and Ph.D. all from in history from UCLA. And Bob and I are both also have history backgrounds. And so we're pretty excited to have this conversation. As a background, Los Angeles, we've seen mass street protests break out, as we have also seen an increase in ICE raid operations in the Los Angeles area. We're seeing them all over the country, but Los Angeles has seemed to be a focal point. And then we've also seen a lot of protests and community resistance to this, which has led to Donald Trump federalizing units in the California National Guard and even bringing in a battalion of Marines. So welcome to the Green and Red podcast, Professor Ochoa.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you both.
And I think maybe to kick it off is we've seen this sort of dramatic increase, what seems like a dramatic increase in ICE operations. But I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the sort of more like previous history before Trump had resumed office. And what was the sort of ICE raid operations like in Los Angeles during the Biden years, for example? We hear a lot about Obama was the deporter in chief and Biden did a lot of deportations and put a lot of money into ICE. But how much of a dramatic difference do we see between the Biden years and Trump?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In the Biden years, right, the Border Patrol, ICE, after formation of ICE, has always been terrorizing the community in a variety of ways. There's been significant fear at different times, right? It ebbs and flows with the amount. As you mentioned, yes, under Obama, it was definitely high. Under the first Trump period, it elicited a significant amount of fear, very clearly based on his even just announcement of his presidency. It was the first time that rhetoric had reached a national level in such a virulent way. And so it really invoked a lot of fear within the community. And at different points, the ICE raids were significant in 2017, 2018, 2019. Under Biden, yes, things subsided a bit in terms of the overt, right, mass raids, definitely as we're seeing now under Trump. Clearly, ICE was still very active under Biden. However, there was a little more negotiation, I think, able to be done between the Biden administration and the Democratic Party-run city and county and state that has put into place a lot of really important reforms over the past 2 decades in terms of sanctuary, in terms of those events. And so when we come to the Trump period, this is the second Trump period. This is a very different kind of a scaled up process we're seeing. And if I look at the feed in any morning today, right, there are ICE raids all over LA at this point, right? There were about 1,000, they said there were about 150 or so, 100 to 150 or so ICE officers at Dodger Stadium earlier today in the morning. There are ICE raids at different Home Depots and Lowe's and other kind of similar kind of stores throughout the city. So in the city proper, but also up in San Fernando Valley, out here where I am in the San Gabriel Valley, all the way further east into the Inland Empire, into Riverside. There are reports all the time. And literally, as one of the organizations said today, be careful, the migra is everywhere. It really is. So this is something really very different. I think there are historical precedents, definitely. But it is definitely scaled up from what we saw in Obama and Biden. at least the
I don't,
residents.
oops, sorry.
Nope.
I don't want to get too far ahead, but you mentioned Dodger Stadium. I've seen conflicting reports just like before we got on that the Dodgers aren't allowing ice in. Is there any resolution of that or?
I'm not sure. I don't think they're allowing ice in, as far as I know, but they were there, right, around I think the Dodgers did make a statement, right? They're not allowing them in.
Because one of the reports said that they were actually bringing people in or as a holding area inside a stadium. So I don't.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I haven't.
I've heard
the resolution of those.
there's a million things going around.
There
so
are.
I'm just curious.
But yes, and the Dodgers are in their own kind of little hot water as well. They've been
With the national anthem singer.
the national anthem singer, with having gone to the White House in April.
Yeah.
And of course, recognizing who the Dodger fans largely are.
Sure.
And so there's been even some of the sports writers have been critiquing the Dodgers. Do they not know who they are? And so slowly it seems like they are coming out and supporting.
Yeah. The actual question I was going to ask, though, is you mentioned the history of immigration. What's the history of the resistance? It seems like from the start, these immigrant support networks have a pretty good infrastructure there. And I'm assuming Trump doesn't shock them. They probably were preparing for this. But has this been noticeable for a while now, these kind of groups?
Yes. Yeah, it's amazing, right? Because, the different demonstrations that have been happening, the mobilizing of hundreds of thousands of people, which over the past, during the No Kings thing that happened all over the U.S., it was very notable, right, that yes, there were the large demonstrations in downtown in Los Angeles, but then they were all over the place as well, all over Long Beach, different parts of Los Angeles, out in the San Gabriel Valley in multiple places, and they oftentimes lasted 2 days. There was a second day protest in March. And I think that testimony, the large-scale resistance movement that is resistance to ICE in support of immigrant workers, it runs deep. The infrastructure is very strong. It's strong. It comes out of these various previous legacies of anti-immigrants, anti-immigrant actions that we've seen in California, and over time has built into kind of large, strong networks of folks who are raiding, who are fighting against the raids, creating support networks. And that happens at the grassroots level, right? And the more kind of Mexican-American, Chicano, Latino left, and in the more mainstream immigrant rights movements are there. There has been an infrastructure in place that's developed over the course of the past, really, arguably since the 80s, over time, since the fight over IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, that began to be put into place.
And with the resistance, we did a show last week with someone in LA from the Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment, ACE, talking about some of the resistance. And so it's definitely, then we saw David Huerta arrested, and I think he's charged with a felony. And labor involved here, community organizations, you see the national community organizations. Are we seeing other intersectional sort of like support and solidarity, Black-led community organizations, for example, or anything like that? Are we seeing like a sort of real resistance popping up here, not just out of the Mexican and Central American communities?
Yeah, I think it's pretty widespread, right? Definitely, right, emanating from the immigrant rights movement and its connection to organized labor, and a lot of other allies that have been working closely. So Black Lives Matter LA was very visible as well at some of these protests. There's the Black Immigrants for Justice movement as well, right? A significant Black population of immigrants that have also been organized, that have been part of this discussion and in this movement. We're in Pride Month, so a strong queer contingent is there. The Pride flags have been in various places at times, so that this is, I think, there is a broad-based resistance here that encompasses a wide group of people, right? Again, from more Democratic Party folks down the line. And again, I think a lot of it too builds off the Black Lives Matter protests that happened in 2020 in LA, in which, immigrants, Latinos, Latinas, white folks, working class folks, immigrant rights folks, as well as labor, were out there in the streets, really brought the city to a standstill for a good amount of time. And so I think that there's been a lot of this different organizing that serves that base in which is being picked up here. And it doesn't hurt also that the way the administration seems to be wantonly attacking everybody, that everyone feels attacked.
This started, they were supposed to be targeting people for whatever reason. It seems like now they're doing sweeps at Home Depots, I think. Is that what's going on? They're just grabbing people to meet quotas, basically? Yeah.
That's definitely what's happening. They are trolling different areas in different cities, that are by and large, right, where there are immigrants, and literally, and I think very quickly at this point, stopping, asking them where they're from. If they respond or don't respond, they pick them up and kidnap them, basically. It's happening very quickly at this point. The operation, and they're literally trolling the streets. So I heard earlier today in front of a bus stop, there were several gardeners right in front of the bus stop today in Los Angeles. Boom, they stopped, swept them up, literally. And then, of course, people get picked up. They go into this hole that we don't really know what exactly happens to them. No one has access into. Oftentimes they go to Adelanto where the ICE holding is, but sometimes they also get picked up and moved. I heard some people were talking today about their uncle being in tents now after being picked up a couple of days ago, in tents in Texas. And families tend not to hear about them until they are in their origin country. So yeah, it has a sense of these kind of wide-scale sequestering. I would say, thinking about Latin America and thinking about where a lot of people are coming from, these are disappearances of people.
Yeah.
And it seems like, yes, they're trying to meet a quota, and they're doing it quickly. And I think that kind of is in line with this ambivalence that the administration is beginning to show. The farmers are now saying that they're good workers, are not coming and we're going to have trouble. But what did he say as well about hospitality sector? These different sectors of the economy are being affected, so ICE is going to leave those areas alone. ICE says, right, the Homeland Security folks say, no, we're not, but they seem to be doing that. And in the meantime, though, trying to meet the quota of, 3,000 a day.
3,000 a day.
3,000 a day, right? And therefore going into areas where workers are. So this is clearly an attack on immigrants, which seems to be largely Latino, but not exclusively by any stretch of the imagination, although that's the profile, and folks that are workers. So this is an attack on workers as well and their families. And so people are afraid. They're in their house. They're trying not to come out. There are definitely networks emerging and there in different communities, trying to bring people food, go to the store for them. So these mutual support networks, again, some of which began to flourish during the pandemic, are reinvigorated.
And is there a longer history of that in Southern California, Los Angeles? This is in many ways, this is a long struggle. We've seen a lot of exploitation, but then also repression of migrants from Latin America. And so are these like mutual aid networks or mutual aid behavior? Is that a normal thing in the history of those communities?
Yes, it is. Some of the ones I'm talking about now that are emerging, right, tend to be ones more connected to the pandemic and that kind of mutual aid organizing that happened. However, the mutual aid organizing, the mutual aid kind of sense of helping within the community, that runs very deep into the history of Los Angeles and the history of the Mexican communities. The mutualista kind of movement, mutualist movement that had its kind of starts out of labor in work spaces in particular, and workers in different sectors in the turn of the 20th century, beginning to pool their funds for health insurance, for burial insurance, not health insurance, burial insurance, unemployment insurance, beginning to pool their money when the families needed to. These kind of structures, they run deep in there, and some of those are kept up throughout. But there's also immigrants have their networks as well, even more recent immigrants, because they're coming oftentimes, right, to communities where they have members from their hometowns. And so they're also part of these kind of larger transnational networks. And again, it depends where and it depends on the community where they're able to, yes, provide some support for them. I think what we're seeing, yep, please.
No, go ahead.
What we're seeing now, I think, is right, are folks kind of making those connections and maybe pulling together a lot of those local networks into a larger potential movement of sorts. But that kind of mutual aid, that mutual support runs deep because you're right. Going back from the early 20th century, there have been waves of really a revolving door of immigration, encouraging immigration, followed by in the teens and 20s, followed by mass deportation in the 1930s. In the 1930s, the unconstitutional repatriation or deportation of at least 500,000 Mexicans, oftentimes right around the LA area, happened. And then by the time of the war and the Bracero program in 1942 and beginning to encourage many more to come and work in the fields and on legal contracts, and then many more coming informally. And then again, Operation Wetback in the 1950s, and these, again, mass deportations of folks who are oftentimes Mexican citizens, but many as well were their Mexican-American born children who would be deported in this way. And so this cycle is built in, and we can carry that forward to the 1960s and 1970s and the anti-immigrant movement then, and then well into the 80s. So these are well-worn patterns.
Right.
And so there has definitely been built-in resistance throughout that. Again, organized labor, and sometimes has played an important role, and other times has played a negative role. But the 1930s, 1940s, organized labor working with the Communist Party, working with various Chicano Mexican-American organizations would help to create the Congress of Spanish-Speaking People, Josefina Fierros and Luisa Moreno, the Guatemalan labor organizer, and others, to work to defend the population on the basis of their national condition as Spanish speakers, to go beyond the narrow focus on just Mexicans, but also on the West. So these have, there are numerous examples of such.
You mentioned labor. What about the school system? I saw an interview a couple of weeks ago with, I believe, the superintendent who seemed to say he wasn't going to let ICE in, the teachers. And what about the churches? I know the Pope just told bishops to go to migration hearings. Are you seeing that in LA as well, where the schools and the churches are involved?
Yeah, and this is something really, I don't want to say it's different from the past, but definitely in terms, there's always been, really since the 1980s, a strong sense in the churches and in the schools, among teachers, among the labor unions, in defense of immigrant children and in defense of their families and immigrants. In the 1980s, in California, the various anti-immigrant movements that were connected, especially going after Central Americans who were fleeing the U.S.-backed wars in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, but also more covertly in Honduras, were coming in large numbers. The Reagan administration, what made the case that they were not political refugees, that they were economic refugees, and therefore should be deported. And again, the forerunner to ICE, the INS, rounded folks massively, and the churches popped into action. The churches with the Central American solidarity groups, with Central American organizations, the Central American Resource Center, El Rescate, and others began to defend immigrants, and the church became a space of sanctuary. A sanctuary, of white Christians beginning to be in solidarity with immigrants, to even the Catholic Church having spaces where immigrants could come in and were welcome and could be sheltered, from INS raids. And so the church really began in the 1980s, and the Catholic Church really played that really powerful role. And that influenced even the cardinal. And again, as the parishioner base is transforming from largely white, ethnic, to, at this point, more than half Mexican, Latino, Central American, they also then recognized that they had to switch. Obviously connected as well, in the case of the church and the Catholic Church, to liberation theology in 1968 and the Medellin Conference and even before, but also this sense of having the preferential option for the poor. By the 80s, right, with the Reagan administration clamping down, then the church opens up and plays that role of supporting to a much greater degree, and a lot of the Christian churches as well. The teachers were also doing that. The structure, however, of the district in the 1980s and 90s was more traditional conservative Democratic Party, oftentimes, and even the union, right, was still controlled in a more, what's the word? What's a nice way to say it? I don't need to say it nicely, but in a way that was anti-immigrant. By the 90s, definitely by the 2000s, that transforms. And so we see now, right, we're in a situation where the mayor is, right, strongly speaking out and saying it wasn't and isn't just criticizing the deployment of the National Guard and the Marines. She's definitely doing that, but she's also saying no ICE out of LA. So that the superintendent, right, in a show of great strength, is drawing the line and when he speaks, he is upset. These are students. Students need a secure place. We're going to the extent to which they can, right, help them. And I think that a lot of that is from this transformation over the past couple decades, which transformed the character of Los Angeles and who was voting. And then the much more immigrant-friendly city infrastructure that's been created, especially in the 2000s. And so I think that reflects it. And it reflects the fact that Los Angeles and Los Angeles County, the estimate is about 1/3 is immigrant, born in another country,
Right.
which means that 60% of children have at least one immigrant parent. Probably a larger percentage have immigrant grandparents. And so there's large mixed status families. So it's not just, so while they can say we're just going after the immigrants, the immigrants, of course, have been here in a large cases, right? Largely of the undocumented population, the vast majority have been here way over 10 years, not longer. Remember, we haven't had immigration reform in any meaningful way since 86. So some are even 20 years. So they are part of the community and the fabric of society. And so it's not easy to make these targeted attacks without really disrupting family systems and community systems. And so the church has definitely been much stronger in the past. And again, I think Pope Francis, I think that helped to do it, and the new Pope as well. And in the schools, what we're seeing in the schools, it is fairly unprecedented from the leadership. Now, from the membership of UCLA and the faculty unions, over the past 2 decades, we've seen a leftward swing in those movements where where we're not just fighting for, right, our own economic gain, we also see that as tied to the community, who the students are, what their backgrounds are, part of this larger struggle, so that there's been a growth of these more social justice unions and a greater effort to connect to the community.
One thing I'm curious, since we're on institutions a little bit,
Sure.
and in educational institutions, are we seeing similar sort of behavior with the university level? Like, universities don't have to kick ICE off of their campus the way they're having to keep them out of schools and the school district. But are you seeing at your own school or other schools, are you seeing a lot of more of a leftward swing and more solidarity, particularly on this issue amongst faculty around the Los Angeles area?
Yes, definitely we're seeing more of that, and that we're seeing more pronouncements by university presidents, by faculty, by organizations in solidarity with immigrants, with a much more of a consciousness about the immigrant population. Definitely. And I think a lot of that has to do with what happened during the first Trump administration, because the first Trump administration caught a lot of people off guard. And although there was a lot of rhetoric in California around undocumented students and being supportive of them, the real infrastructure wasn't fully there. Backing up, in 2001, right, California passed the Assembly Bill 540, which provided in-state tuition to all who were residents, and it redefined residents as anyone who's graduated from high school and had lived in the U.S. 3 years, which meant that undocumented folks could, right, and this is before DACA, could then pay in-state tuition, and then there would be, over the next decade, a fight to then create the California Dream Act, which allows then students to get state aid. Obviously not federal aid, but state aid. And so that movement really, from the 90s of undocumented students, had propelled the institution to transform in ways and open itself up. Now, by the 2010, 2014, even though under Obama, yes, that led to DACA because Obama didn't really do much, spent his political capital elsewhere and did not deliver on immigration reform for all kinds of reasons. But they'll created DACA, and then that opened it up for undocumented students, again, who met a certain requirements to be able to have this status of DACA. And so the universities, yes, incorporated that, but still knew very little. And so by 2016, when Trump comes into power, he's making these very virulently anti-immigrant statements. As I said before, right, that instills significant fear among students, among elementary school students, right? My partner teaches first and second grade. Students were literally crying, hearing, all right, about it, what's going to happen, how are they going to do it. So it runs deep. And so at that point, we began to ask at our university, and this happened to other faculty as well, began to ask administration, okay, we have these structures. What are we going to do now if ICE comes here? And there were no policies in place. And so I think through faculty and student organizing, that, especially in the Trump administration, that forced administrations to be able to begin to create some kind of infrastructure. Dream centers were created in many campuses, right, to support undocumented students or documented students. That was, right, pushed along the undocumented students, their own activism, their own being undocumented, unafraid movement, push that forward, fighting the raids that were happening as well, helped to solidify their organizing. And so undocumented students created in California, the California Dream Network, statewide, working with the Coalition of Humane Immigrant Rights LA. And then other networks were formed locally of undocumented queer students, and all along thinking in terms of their undocumented status, their status as workers, but also their status as queer folks, and beginning to take a much more intersectional kind of analysis of their approach. And so that movement, I think, right, has forced the universities to pay attention and to issue pronouncements, and then have to say, yes, we will not be directly working, and most have said, right, directly with ICE. And if anyone sees ICE on campus, you are to call, except for when they're here for a career day, you're to call campus police. And then people said, but campus police, what does that mean if you campus police?
People should still call campus police on them if they're there for career day, in my opinion.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yes. So that a lot of that has been, right, that infrastructure is there because of the movement and because faculty organizing. And in different places, that is oftentimes the faculty, the union has been oftentimes pushed in that direction. I belong to the California Faculty Association, and for a long time, the social club that existed transformed itself, as I said, over the past 2 decades into a real union, and into a social justice union, and backed in 2001 the DREAM Act, and began to say, okay, these are our students. How do we? So I think that's in part why we're seeing those pronouncements. I also think the attacks on immigrants that happened previously in the 1980s and in 1994, in particular in California with Proposition 187, right, spawned a whole generation of folks who began to vote and entered public office. And so with that, then we begin to see transformation of laws in the state of California, thanks to the lobbying of immigrant rights organizations like CHIRLA, the transformations of the labor unions because of, again, oftentimes Central American labor organizers being pushed out of their country and having already labor organizing backgrounds and political backgrounds, and joining Justice for Janitors and working there, and other unions that then forced themselves onto the scene and into the eyes of the labor movement that then had to transform itself. And so all of that political organizing has really been at play here in different ways.
I wanted to ask a bit about the protests. Obviously, Trump is full of shit, talking about how he has to save LA, it's going to be destroyed, all that. And I'm sure a lot of us, all of us probably have seen the little map, which has a little red dot in LA County so what's actually happening there? How many different places are seeing these actions? I think we all know that I.C.E. and other groups like that tend to provoke people, but what's the scene going on right now in the last couple of weeks, actually?
Yeah, so I think the last couple of weeks, definitely, right, the announcement of the raids, the beginning to see the raids beginning to happen, led to a concentration initially in downtown LA, right, because that is where the federal building was. That's where one of the main, right, it's where the prison, that's where prisons and the ICE detention center is, one of them downtown. So that's an important kind of central place. Again, that 1 square mile area. And so people went there initially to see what they could do to, I think, protest and some disrupt as well, and impede the operations. And and I think people made themselves, right, heard loud and clear. Clearly, the way the media, the way that the administration responded in this way, emphasizing the violence. And clearly, right, there were definitely examples of, right, people throwing some things in a small number, and then the Waymo cars being taken and being burned. And the massive violence that's been taking place, right, by ICE, by the administration, sequestering folks, kidnapping folks, disrupting the family. That violence is what's in the minds of people when they're out there. And that violence has been largely ignored by the media, and definitely is not talked about, right, in any way, really, by the administration. So folks are really, right, angered by that violence of the disruption of the community, of this sense that we've tried to create this sense of, right, people have been here, these are our communities, and there are these invading forces coming in. And so initially, yes, it was very much in that area.
Oh, let me just follow up for a minute on that, because most of the focus, I think, that I've heard from people like Newsom and Bass is about ICE and what Trump has done. But I'm also reading that the California cops are bashing people's heads in too, the state police, LAPD. And or Newsom and Bass is their issue just they don't want Trump bashing people's heads in, but they will continue to support these repressive things, or?
Yeah. No, it's a great point, right? And I think this is the inherent contradiction in these notions of, on the one hand, we're in solidarity with immigrants and we want to support them, and the police then will follow along and support them and not directly, again, in theory, directly coordinate with ICE. But in reality, their function leads them to coordinate with ICE indirectly, even if they're not overtly coordinating with them. Yeah, and so the police are playing that role of the kind of the front line folks. And under the guise of public order, allowing this to happen, I think they're seen as no contradiction there, when clearly there is. Because they're the ones that right? They're the ones doing the dirty work for the administration. And they're the ones taking more of the heat. And they're the ones who've always been doing this, and the protest against the police in LA and the LA sheriffs and the LAPD go way back. Over the past decade or so, it has been far more intense. Black Lives Matters, a number of police killings of Blacks and Latinos throughout the area. The protests have been very strong. And so, yes, when people see the LAPD and see the sheriff there, it's hard to make a distinction between them and ICE, them and the National Guard.
I mean, the LAPD and LA Sheriff are notorious institutions that going back 100 years or 150 years or what have you. And earlier you had talked about how under Karen Bass, LA was seen as an immigrant-friendly city and sanctuary city. And I was a question that Bob asked. I was like asking at that when you were talking about that. But how is Bass's policies about it being an immigrant-friendly city while the LAPD and the LA sheriffs, I guess she's not over the LA sheriffs, but how they're being deployed to interfere. Protesters and communities in resistance are interfering with ICE operations, and the LAPD is interfering with those protests and the resistance. And understanding all these things in a bureaucracy are complicated, but I'm just wondering what you think about that. Is there's like what she says, and there's what we see the LAPD
That's right.
doing.
Yeah, no, and that's great, right, to lay that out, because yes, definitely on the surface and in rhetoric, this rhetoric is very strong, right? Which again is historic, so it's worth mentioning that. But yeah, the functions and the structures are something very different, right? Because although she's elected by and she recognizes who the constituents are, we also know that the downtown folks are filled with yes, financial companies and other well-off elites of the capitalist class that she's also is responsive to, and obviously more responsive to. And so the police, into this notion of maintaining order, she's doing her job. Which again, because even though, yes, as a progressive Democrat who came up through the social movements and then the nonprofits and then went to Congress and then came back, has ties with movement folks. But in the end, she's the mayor of a city that is one of the more wealthy cities in the nation and has a large working class community. But who's really in charge? Yeah, this is a class society. And so I think that the LAPD, which is definitely directly under her, can argue that they're doing law and order, and they can say that they're not working with ICE, but they clearly are, because again, their job is to do that. So yeah, it's a complete contradiction. And we do see it's LAPD and it is sheriffs that are there.
I haven't followed closely the exact words that Bass has been saying, but I've been actually following the words that maybe because I'm in the Bay Area, Newsom used to be the mayor here, but I've been following the words that Newsom says much more closely, because for him, it's very much about, one, he probably sees this as Trump is trying to undermine him. And so he is like pushing back on Trump, because a lot of what his rhetoric is, he's like, peaceful protest, as long as it's peaceful protest. And we worked with ICE before Trump came in to take 10,000 criminal undocumented people off the street, that sort of thing. And so I think just digging in a little bit above the sort of like rhetoric, where the tough guy rhetoric, where Gavin Newsom says, come arrest me, you get into a little bit of what's really going on here, because the Democrats are like no less complicit in much of this. I guess it's not the sort of like on steroids the way it's going on right now, but they're no less complicit in this, including like California Democrats.
That's right. No, that's right. The California Democrats, a lot of that is rhetoric and some institutional changes, but what's beneath the surface, is much more entrenched, militarized police presence and police state in various aspects of it that's there. So yeah, and so even Bass, still the argument was always, whenever she would do her press conferences with the police chief, it's peaceful protest, First Amendment stuff. And so that kind of rhetoric around peaceful protest, yes, is clearly saying, and the chief would say it as well, very directly, we'll arrest you.
Right.
So we know where their interest lies. Yes, they want to kind of contradict Trump in different ways, help propel, well, in Gavin's case, his career forward, and incorporate immigrants within society, yet still not see any kind of major transformation. Because the contradiction here is also, that the immigrants that in theory they're protecting are heavily exploited by the structures that they preside over.
I don't know if Bob has a question. Can I ask a real quick thing?
Yeah, go ahead, follow up.
Yes. We're talking about the capitalist class. The capitalist class is very interested in maintaining stability. It's actually been a big theme of a lot of our shows. It's about how the capitalist class is interested in stability more than anything else. But the capitalist class, assuming particularly in Los Angeles, is very reliant on immigrant labor.
Right.
And I'm just wondering how much we've heard how there's people in the hospitality sector and people in big ag are like lobbying cabinet members to get Trump to back off, which may or not be happening because he's just a whack job and he flip-flops every day on things. But how much are we seeing the capitalist class in Los Angeles is relying on migrant labor to be like really in distress about this? And maybe that's not something we'll see until a little bit later. But
Yeah.
I just wondered if you have any sense of that.
I think, again, I think it's a fine line for them because of their labors on the one hand. And I think in some ways we see this, right? Rick Caruso, the big real estate magnate out there who ran against Bass and even began to critique her during the fires and all that. He's come out against, yes, the National Guard being there, and at the same time indicating that the police could handle it. And so that they're trying to walk this line, right? Stand in for the strength of the state of California and be there and be supportive of kind of workers, while at the same time jumping on this rhetoric of safety and law and order, which plays very nicely into the Trump hands, because he can then make the case over and over again without much evidence. That's what their focus is. It's about this law and order. And so the Democrats, as we know, have never been too far away from the law and order stuff, even under Nixon, right? The Democrats let the war on poverty become the war on crime. It was, even though, yes, that was Republican, but that transformation went fairly easily because they didn't allow the war on poverty infrastructure really to sink in too deeply. So this kind of notion of public safety, and I think that kind of raises its head there. And so I don't know exactly. It will definitely be interesting to see in the coming months on how the capitalist class has been, where they've been lobbying, how they've been pushing it. I think it's like at the national scene, right? They're standing back. They're trying to make some lobbying effort. They don't want to upset the president in any large way at this point, because they're fearful that they'll, expropriate something. Who knows what they'll do?
Issue an executive order on where their kids go to school.
And so I think they're laying low.
Not that long ago, it wasn't unusual to hear conservatives call for open borders. They were very candid. We want cheap labor. And there's a clip making its way around of the 1980 Republican debate between Reagan and Bush, where they're both speaking in ways that today will get them labeled radical left.
That's right.
When I moved to Texas to take the job there, I remember in the aftermath of 187, George Bush, the governor, the kid said, "We're not California. We're not doing that here."
That's right.
And you notice there's not a whole lot going on in Texas right now, I assume because those people donated to Trump. But what do you think accounts for that kind of massive change among folks like that? Because immigration is a lot of things, but it's a labor issue, as you pointed out at the very beginning,
That's right.
which we don't really talk about much.
That's right.
And I'm even hearing liberals essentially make the argument that we need to exploit their labor so we can continue to get cheap stuff, right?
That's
But what do you think accounted for this newfound people? I live in Ohio now, and there's no issue here. We don't have immigration issues here. It's Ohio. And yet people are freaking out. That's the most important thing here in Ohio.
And in polls, it's the top issue.
It's with a bunch of Italians who came over the exact same way 100 years ago, which is even bigger. But what do you think accounts for this explosion, as if this is the biggest problem facing America, when I could probably come up with 10 within a minute that are way bigger than this one?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And again, as you mentioned, Bush, again, right? In 2000, was it 2000, 1999? When was George Bush elected? Yes, about 2000. I remember him being on the border there with his boots and his hat and the cowboy hat he gave Vicente Fox, the Mexican president, even though
speaking Spanish. I mean, he spoke Spanish. Yeah.
And they were negotiating an immigration reform. They were very much both liberal capitalists, believing in, yes, the free flow of the factors of production, which includes labor. And that was about to happen. And then 9/11 happened. And that then restructured the whole notion of immigration and criminalization became closely wedded. Clearly that was happening before, right? Under Clinton in the Immigration Reform Act, the one that was also connected there with welfare. There was this kind of criminalization there, and that led to the deportation of many youth who had misdemeanors, but then they were reclassified as more felonies or aggravated misdemeanors, and then they were deported, because under Clinton is when that deportation, right, of folks who were legal permanent residents but committed a crime began to happen. So that criminalization was happening, but really gets solidified after 9/11, and then the construction of the homeland, right? Security and right taking its page out from Israel and beginning to defend the homeland. And so that right away makes it very difficult for even those Rockefeller Republicans or those free trader Republicans, right, to be able to make that case, although many still are. Yeah, and then right, the use of the way immigration was being used anyways throughout U.S. history has always played that role, right, of saying, yes, immigrants are coming and they're taking jobs away, and then they're able to play on that rhetoric, even though at the same time many are benefiting from them in that way. So I think, again, the pattern is there. It definitely picks up after the 2000s, after the homeland security and the kind of notion of immigration as criminals, and without any meaningful immigration reform, right, the number of undocumented people just begin to rise. And it rises. The growing deportations from the U.S. of folks who are youth, right, who might have been in one of the gangs, Central American gangs, the Mata Salvatrucha, the 18th Street gangs, right, gangs who were born in L.A., born in the U.S., of children who were immigrants or growing up in the middle of a deindustrializing city with very little to rely upon, and a state as well that was crumbling. As they're deported increasingly, then they're going over and they're doubly criminalized in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Guatemala. And as those states begin to move towards a neoliberal economy and withdraw from the social services, what begins to happen is, that creates a deep instability in those areas. And so, again, that massive, right, displacement that happens because of neoliberal capitalism, of U.S. foreign policy, all of that then speeds up the number of folks who are fleeing, who are forced to leave their homeland and come through to the U.S. and, yes, appear in communities in larger numbers and aren't embraced in a society that does not work to embrace the neighbor, that does not believe in kind of community in any meaningful way. And I think that's ripe for the pickings. Trump has been able to play that in ways that other know-nothings have done from way back, but now it's so massive. Yeah. The numbers and the immigrants in different areas of the country and not as concentrated.
That's a debate we don't have, like how NAFTA kind of destroyed large segments of, that better than me, Mexican agriculture.
Exactly.
The last question, this has been fantastic, and I'm sure it's not going to go away soon. Maybe we can talk again before too long. But one thing that we mentioned at the beginning, that the various groups that have already been organized and have been working on this issue. But one of the things that, at least viewing it from TV and social media, is that there's also spontaneous rising, and people are coming out essentially on behalf of strangers, right?
That's right.
Which is inspiring, right? Is that kind of, do you get a general vibe among LA, just the entire place, the entire city, the entire county, that people are feeling this?
Definitely. And this past weekend, if I'm not mistaken, for the No Kings weekend.
Yeah, last Saturday.
Was it Saturday? Yeah. Really, we got a sense of that. We can see the feel of that. You're right. There are people who haven't really protested before, going out and protesting, are very upset. People who are even in more conservative communities who are speaking up, that I think, I didn't realize they would be out there in the street.
Yeah.
And so there is this sense. And I think a lot of that kind of goes back to just the blatant racism that folks see in what the Trump administration is doing, and then the arbitrariness of it all, and a sense that they've been in these communities for years. And so I think, it is very inspiring to see what's happening at the same time, right? It's the double edge, but this is where folks are increasingly becoming involved. We've seen these, as I mentioned before, these protests and these No Kings Days in different communities. And I haven't counted them. I'm going to go back and begin to do that. But virtually in almost every suburb, every 2 or 3 suburbs around, right, there were significant protests, which is something that I don't think we definitely haven't seen before. Even Black Lives Matter, right? Many more people came out as well in the same way, but not in different communities. It tended to be more concentrated.
There were over 2,000 nationwide,
Yeah.
no kings. Here in the Bay Area, like different suburbs, like there was a big one in San Francisco and a big one in Oakland, but then they had smaller ones in Walnut Creek. We had 1,000 people here in Berkeley. My actually last question is a little bit related to this, is around the sort of shifting political sands. I saw, no surprise, that like Trump's support with Latinos has plummeted since he's come in and since we've seen this sort of dramatic escalation with ICE operations. But I actually looked it up in prepping for this interview, and in 9 of the 12 Latino majority counties in California, Trump had a net gain. Sometimes it was just like it went from 25 to 30%, but like in Riverside County, which is part of the greater LA area, it's almost 50%. It's a little less than 50%. And I'm wondering how you account for that shift, because this rhetoric around immigration has never stopped from Trump. And I'm wondering how you account for that shift. And in some ways, we can view this past election was like won in the margins, right? It's like maybe they didn't win all these populations, but they like shifted it like 5 or 10 points.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because you're right. Trump has always had, right, a significant minority of Latinos and a larger minority of Latino males. And this last election, definitely that was the case. And it's dropping now. I think it's dropping because I don't think people thought through. I think there was still a sense that he wasn't going to do what he said, that it's Trump. He just speaks. Some things definitely happen, but things have to change. Things have to change. Things are fucked up. They need to change. Again, that could mean all kinds of things. He speaks straight. He says what he does. And I don't think people believed that he would do what he did. And I think that caught a lot of people by surprise, even though all the signs were there. They had done all the studying. It was all lined up what they were going to do, although he denied it. And so people believe that. And I think people are feeling the reality of it, what that means. It's, oh, yes, people are mixed status families and they're voting for Trump. I remember hearing that among students all the time, saying, what do I do? My uncle is voting for Trump. They're voting for Trump. I'm undocumented. We have undocumented people in our family. Talk to your uncle. Why is it, right? Does he think that people are going to be deported? And oftentimes, no, they didn't think that. They didn't think he was really going to do it. So I think the system is, the way the system is set up, that there just seems to be no choice. And Trump has tapped into that in a way that I think Bernie did. Definitely in many different areas, right? But the Democratic Party worked hard to cut him out. And the Democratic Party, right, kept Kamala under, kept Joe. And then Kamala as well, right, being the prosecutor that she is up there. She was up there, as Scott knows, right, that we didn't hear any really new visions and no efforts to connect to the working classes, no efforts to talk about jobs, about inequality. And Trump didn't either. However, right, his rhetoric is such that played to it. So I think there was a lot of that, which I think is what been happening to a lot of working class folks, right, who supported him. But then now seeing what's happening, what that means on the ground, the chaos it's creating, what impact that has on local business, what that means, I think people are seeing that. Now, how long they'll remember that, all that, we don't know. However, by turning those light bulbs on, I think it's important. Even being out there, generally we would hear the first Trump administration, we'd hear a lot of boos, a lot of people yelling at us. That wasn't the case. I was out there with some kids on the street corner in our local community, and out of the, 1,000 hunks, there was one person that said something. And so that, I think there is, again, it's hard to know. I wish I could predict. But as you said, his approach is to keep everything, he's throwing everything at us, right? To keeping us off balance in different ways.
What the zone is, I think what they call it.
That's it. He doesn't know, he's not much of a deal maker. He can't make any deals, therefore open up something else.
He loses, he's on the losing end of deals, and then he declares victory. That's the MO, right? That's the Roy Cohn lesson.
There it is, yeah.
this has been great, and really happy that you came on with us. And
Thank
we should definitely have you on again and talk some more about some
Great. I love it.
many other things. And we're gonna end it now.
Okay.
So, Professor Ochoa, it's been really great having you. And folks, if you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org, hit the support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. But Professor Enrique Ochoa at Cal State LA, thanks for coming on and talking about all of this with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yep.
Thank you.
And everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.